Hello everyone and welcome to the second video that will be part of this tutorial series about the Go programming language, also known as Golang. And in this video we will look at variables. So variables are a very important concept in all programming languages. And so let's define first what variables are in general in all programming languages. So when you write a program, you work a lot with information. And information, as we also discussed in the last video, is stored in our computer under the form of zeros and ones. In our program, however, since we are working with a high-level programming language, we will be working with numbers and with strings. We define what a string is in very simple terms in the last video, and with other type and so on. And still, however, something persists. When we work with data, and that could be a string, so let's call it, but for now, a word, so like hello, or we might have a number 25 or under the number 47. Sometimes we want to assign a name to one of those values, and sometimes on the other hand we might want to have a label that we can update throughout our program. So for example, imagine we're writing a program that checks how many times a person has clicked on a button, and well, we might imagine to have a number that counts that, and that number should be updated every time that a person clicked on a button. And for example, we might want to call this variable with a name, and we might want to call it count, and then we might want to update it every time, so we might want to change the value that is stored inside it. So a variable is precisely that. It's basically we could see it as a box inside of which we can put a value that can be of various types. And again, a type is just a type of data that we can put inside a variable. And in the first video, you might recall that we said that Golang was a strictly typed language. What this means is that in Golang, whenever we define a new variable, then we have to specify its type. So if we define a variable, for example, our counter variable should be a variable of the type of a number type, in particular an integer. On the other hand, if you imagine we have a variable that stores the name of a person, then we might want a variable of type string. And so not only we have to specify the type that a variable will assume in the program, but we also cannot change it throughout the program, meaning that if we declare a variable that will store an integer, then that variable will only be able to store integers throughout the whole program, in contrast with languages, as we mentioned in the last video, such as Python. And again, if you have never used Python, don't worry about it, but in Python, basically, can declare a variable without stating if it will store an integer or a string or whatever other sort of data, and then throughout the program you can update it to a different type of data. In contrast, as we said before, in Golang we will only be able to update a variable that we declare, for example, as integer to other integers. If we, for example, set an integer variable to a string, then we will get an error. Now that we have understand conceptually what variables are, so again, they're basically we could see them as box with the labels on top of it, which help us in many ways. So one way we said already is that we're giving a name to a value, so it's easier to access it during the program. Another thing is that it's a label that contains a value that we can then update inside the program. We can modify, we can access it, and so on. And so these are all uses of variables, and this is why they're so important in programming. But now let's see how to actually define a variable. So in order to define a variable, the syntax is the following. It will be var, and this is a keyword, it means variable, shorthand for variable. Then we will say our name of our variable, and this is arbitrary. This is what's called an identifier in a programming language. It's basically, and in this case it's arbitrary, we can call it whatever we want. We can call it name 1, name 2, we can call it, for example, number, I don't know, whatever you want. And however, be careful that there are some rules about naming that we won't go through now for simplicity. And they vary from programming language to programming language, but they're mostly similar. But for now, let's maybe call it number 1. Once we have set var, the name of our variable, then we want to specify its type. In this case, maybe we might want to work with an integer. And the type for an integer is, the keyword for an integer is int. Once we've said this, we now set the equal operator to assign it a value, and we maybe set it equal to 1. Creates a variable called number 1 that we can access throughout our program. So let's now write a comment that gives the general format for an instruction of this type. So to create a variable, and that is the following. It is var, then the name of the variable, then the type of the variable, and then the equals the value. So this is the syntax for creating a variable. So now we can use and access this variable throughout our program. So imagine we want to print this variable. We can insert it inside the println function, and by running our program, it gets print out to the terminal. So we might now want to change it. We might set it equal to 55, and as you can see, it will get printed out 55. So now you might have a question. What gets printed to the terminal? Is it a string or is it an integer? Maybe this might confuse you at the beginning if you have never programmed before, but the answer to this is actually what gets printed out to the terminal is a string. So even though here we have inserted a number of a int data type, the value that gets printed to the terminal is a string. So it's basically a concatenation of characters. So in the terminal, the data that the user and we will say the data exchange between the user and the program, so the input you insert and the output you receive, are actually strings. And what does it mean to be a string? It's basically a succession of alphanumeric characters. These alphanumeric characters are actually encoded by bits, so by sequences of bits. If you're interested in how this works specifically, you can look up an ASCII chart, and you can see how numbers get mapped to letters and also other characters. For example, also to other numbers, of course, because in the ASCII codification, for example, 48 gets mapped to the character 0. But we won't cover how ASCII and how strings are saved in memory in depth in this course, because of course this is a introductory tutorial to the Golang language. So we will just mention this. So we will just mention that, well, in the terminal, when you print out a number like this, we pass a number, an int type, to this println function. What gets printed in the terminal is basically a conversion of this variable into a string type. And again, in this string gets printed out in the terminal. And so with this said, we are now ready also to introduce some new data types, because I'm sure that at this point you now know how to declare integers. So these integers can also be negative numbers, for example. Okay, let's print both now. Now notice that in the println method, when we insert a comma, the two numbers that we printed get concatenated and a white space gets added in between. So in this case, we printed out 55, then a white space, and then minus 55. This is how it gets formatted when we print with println. So we now can work with integers, both negative and positive integers. But there's a problem. This is pretty limiting, because sometimes, well, we want to work with, of course, with maybe with decimal numbers or with strings. So with basically, we could say words, etc. So how can we do this? We define a variable of another data type. In Golang, there are many other data types. For example, the data type that we use in order to work with decimal numbers is called a float. And float stands for floating point number. This refers to actually to the way in which they're stored in memory, but we won't, again, this is another thing that we won't cover. So just know that float is basically means decimal number. So if we want to define a float, we will use the same format, the same syntax as before. So let's say var number 2, but this time float 32. Oops, 32. And maybe we could set it equal to 3.15. We can set it equal to 3.14, and we can maybe create another floating point variable, float 32, and set it equal to minus 8.7. So these could be two examples. So now we can print them out, and let's see what we get. Okay, and this is what we get. With this said, we now have introduced floating point numbers and integers. But there's also another important data type we will work with, and we introduced it in the last video, and that is the string. So for now, let's remove these variables that we created here. So suppose that we want to create a string. Maybe we want to print to the console, hello world, for example. Well then, to declare a string which contains the value of hello world, we will just define it as follows. We could say var, you can call it message, maybe, message, then string, which is the data type, and then we set it equal to hello world. And then we just pass this message inside the println function, and let's see what happens. We get hello world in the terminal. Now I want to expose you to one of the first errors that you will encounter pretty often in Golang, and that is, let's try to basically print something out, so maybe hello, and let's basically leave this variable that we defined unused. So let's try to run the program now, and now you see we get an error. It says message declared and not used. So what happened is that the Golang compiler saw that here we define a variable that, with name message, that we do not use throughout the program. So basically this variable is just useless and it just occupies space that it does not use. So now let's try to comment this out, and we see that then now the program works. So basically this is another good feature of Golang, that basically it tells us whenever we declare a variable that we didn't use. This also works with imports. When we import a library that we do not use, we will get an error. So but we will see importing and packages later, so for now don't worry about it. So now the last data type that we will cover in this video is the Boolean data type, and where a Boolean data type basically can assume only two states, and that is false or true. And these Boolean data types are very, very important in programming because you can use them to check for conditions and other things. And we will later see how you can work with Boolean data types also to make selection instructions. Selection instructions are basically instructions which can tell us how to they can tell us what to do based on a condition. We will later introduce them when we will talk about them in the future videos. For now, just know that a Boolean data type is something that can be false or true. For example, we can say var is maybe older than 20, and you can put this equal to a bool, and we can put it equal to true. And for example, we can also say var is older than 25, bool, and we can put this equal to false. So print Boolean data types to the console. So for example, if we print is older than 20 and then is older than 25, then let's see what we get. As you can see, we get true and false. And again, here we have white space in between because the println function automatically adds a white space in between when we concatenate two values inside it. So with this said, I think that we covered enough in this video, and in the next video we will start looking at some other ways to print out stuff to the console using other methods of the font library.